My name's Darrell Tucker. My date of birth is December 13, 1942. My dad, Robert Earl Tucker. My mom was born as Helen Elizabeth Gibson, so she became Helen Elizabeth Tucker.
Okay, and tell me a little bit about your dad. What was he like?
Probably one of the best persons I've ever known. He was he was a rock of the community that he lived in. Lived there once they got to Arkansas. He lived there his entire life. I don't know, he was just as straightforward, hardworking, caring individual as I can think of.
What about your mom? How would you describe your mom?
Just as good a person. She never worked outside the home, and she made it a great home for my brother and I to grow up in. And she provided so that my dad could do his work, whatever it happened to be at the time. Just a great person also. I was really fortunate.
Tell me about your father's parents. Who were his parents?
My dad's parents were Oliver Tucker and Ethel. Well, her maiden name was, oh Lord, now, what is her maiden name? I've lost it. All I can think of is Newbie, Helen.
That's okay if you don't remember.
Well, is it Siegel?
Schlegel?
Schlegel, that's it, I'm sorry. Okay, can you want me to do that again?
If you want to.
Okay. My grandfather on my dad's side was Oliver Newby Tucker, and my grandmother was, last name was Schlegel, and she was a great lady. I didn't know my grandfather because he had passed away before I was born.
Tell me about your mother's parents.
Okay. My mother's father was Robert Gibson, and her mother was Nettie Anderson Gibson.
And what are your earliest memories of your mom?
The first thing I remember about my mom was when I was 3 years old. She and I rode a train to California, to San Diego. My dad was in the Navy at the time. It was during World War II. And I remember some of the train ride with her, but what I most remember then is living there in San Diego in an apartment.
What are your earliest memories of your dad?
When in San Diego again, just remember riding my tricycle with the two of them when we'd walk places in the neighborhood, and remember him being in his uniform, being in the Navy and everything. So I guess that's my first memories.
What are your earliest memories of or what memories do you have of your dad's parents? You said you didn't know.
Well, I didn't know my grandfather, as I said. My grandmother lived kind of across the hill from us. We were north of Highland Church, and she was south, or we were south of Highland Church, she was north of Highland Church. And you could walk kind of across country to get from one to the other if you chose to. I remember her working real hard. She always did her laundry outside, and she hung it outside, and she had an apple orchard that all us kids liked to play in, had a barn with a loft that we liked to play in. She was always just a pleasant, great lady. She had a great sense of humor. I remember that.
What about your mom's parents? What do you remember about them? What were they like?
My mom's parents lived within sight of our house, so I could look down and see if they were in or out of the house. My grandfather was a farmer. He farmed sweet potatoes, was his main crop, and he had corn that he fed to the cattle. and they had a sweet potato storage thing down underneath in the cellar in their house. And I remember going down there and eating raw sweet potatoes. Those were so sweet, so good. My grandmother, or grandma we called her, but she was a great cook. They hired lots of temporary people when they were harvesting the crops. And I remember sitting around the table with them at lunch, and she would have a huge spread for everybody that was working there, and we ate at her house a lot too. So that's what I remember most, is watching her in the kitchen.
Tell me about your brother. Who's your brother and what was he like?
My brother is Darrell Tucker. He's about 3 years younger than I am. And I don't know, the first thing I remember about my brother is rocking him in a little red rocking chair that my mom and dad had bought for us. I was enough older that I could hold him without him falling, I guess. We played together a lot, but as typical with older brothers and younger brothers, if I had my cousin out that was my age, then I tried to find things for Gerald to do that kept him doing something besides what we were doing. So I do remember that. He was a good friend as we grew up, I felt. But I probably wasn't, doing things like that probably wasn't the best older brother that I could have been. But we had a lot of good times together. Played there on the farm.
Tell me about your family's business. You said your mom worked in the home, but what did your dad do? What was his family? What was the family business?
Okay, well, my family, when I was growing up, as I said, Mom worked in the home, but my dad was a farmer. He had pigs and milk cows and beef cattle. He farmed some of the same area that my mom's dad farmed. And there was a big land up on the hill that he had corn. I remember helping him harvest the corn, sitting on the tractor with him and that kind of stuff. Later, he sold his equipment and his cattle and became a carpenter. His dad was a carpenter, my grandfather, Tucker. And so he had learned the trade as a boy. And so he became a carpenter. And he worked, first we moved to Oregon for about 6 months. It was raining so much that year he had trouble keeping work, so we moved back to in the area to Tulsa, Oklahoma, lived there for 6 months, and then went back to Arkansas. And my dad then worked with a couple of our neighbors that were also carpenters. They went over to Ponca City, Oklahoma to work during the week, and then they'd come home on the weekend. And then finally he was able to get a job as a carpenter for Toon Construction Company in Fayetteville, and so he moved back home on the farm still, and worked with them until he retired. And he became the superintendent for a lot of their commercial building. He quit doing the hand carpentry himself, but was a superintendent.
What was your part in the family business?
In the farming part, I was involved all the time. I helped in harvesting the corn. I helped in putting the hay bales up on the wagons so we could take them to the barn, helped them get them into the barn. I milked cows by hand. Mom had chickens, and I'd help her in breaking the necks of chickens sometimes when it was time to eat one, and harvested eggs with her some. She did most of the egg thing, and I slopped the pigs and whatever was done around the farm. We didn't have a bathroom, indoor toilet or anything. We didn't have indoor water when I was growing up. So I'd have to go out to the well and get water to bring it in for Mom, that kind of thing. And I remember my dad, before he quit farming, started baling commercially, I guess you'd call it. He baled for neighbors and all around that area. And I'd ride on the baler with him when we were going to a job. Didn't have to carry the hay that time. We'd just bale it, and then somebody else would pick it up and and take it. But I remember one time we were going over to Savoy, when it's quite a distance from where we lived, and we had a baler that had 3 wheels, had 2 in the back that where the hay went in and was baled and came out, and 1 in the front that just was attached by just a straight stick or a straight thing to the tractor thing, and that would, when they turned, that wheel would turn so that it could follow the tractor. And we were going down this big hill and to Savoy, and my dad put the brakes on the tractor. Well, the baler didn't have any brakes, and I was sitting over this wheel on the front of the baler, and it started whipping back and forth because it was trying to pass the tractor. I held on with all my might, and my dad, I think, thought he was going to lose me. He finally got the thing under control, and we stopped, and both of us kind of stood there and panted for a while. But I really thought it was going to throw me right in front of the baler pickup part, which would not have been good. And there wasn't much to hold on there, but I held on with everything I had. And I'll never forget that experience.
About how old were you when that happened?
When this baler incident happened, I was probably 8, something like that. And I didn't say that, during my younger years, my dad had me drive the tractor in the field. I was too young to buck the hay, so he'd load the bales and I'd drive the tractor. And I was small enough at the time that I had to stand up to put the brakes on. I can remember that. I couldn't get enough pressure if I just sat down and did it. In fact, I couldn't even reach them well enough to get that done. So I was 7 or 8 when I started driving the tractor, and like I say, I'm probably this 8 years old when that almost fell off the baler incident.
What about the construction business? Did you help in that any?
I worked with my dad in construction when I was in high school. I worked every summer with him. I think it was when I was 15. So after my sophomore year, I worked in the summer, and then junior year, and then the senior year. And then each vacation that we had when I was in college, I went to the University of Arkansas, and so I'd work every holiday time off. That's the way I earned my way through college. And I want to tell you too, when I was working with him in construction, I always felt like he gave me the dirtiest, hottest jobs that he could, and I think he did it so that I wouldn't quit going to college. He wanted me to finish. I was the first one in our family that went to college.
Give me some examples of that. What kind of...
Well, at that time, the things that we did when I was working with my dad, I was a laborer, and my job primarily was pushing wheelbarrows, digging ditches, tying rebar, cleaning up after the carpenters, holding boards sometimes for the carpenters, or hauling boards to the carpenters, that kind of stuff. But mainly just getting the materials to them, and jackhammering, all the stuff that shakes you up, and it's hot, dirty work. I remember having to push wheelbarrows full of concrete up a ramp to get it up to the top of a wall so you could pour the wall. We didn't have those pumps like they have now that would put the concrete right into the wall, but that's the kind of stuff I did.
Besides working on the farm and with your dad in the construction business, what other jobs did you have as a kid?
Okay, while I was growing up, the only jobs that I did truly during my growing up years were just as I described with my dad, either on the farm or in the construction thing. The first job other than working for my father was after my junior year in college. I was the manager, I guess you'd call it, of the Little League program in Fayetteville. And my job with that was to create the schedule for all the teams and be sure everybody was, knew what they had to do. Ran the concession stand, bought the materials, whatever went in the concession stand. Hired people or volunteers, ran the concession stand, raked the fields, mowed the lawn, the grass. Had to be sure the line was done. I had to do that and get it all ready for the games. Then I had to be at all the games. So I did that for my junior summer after in college. And in doing that, I couldn't do all that myself and getting the fields ready. So I would go to the jail every morning, and they'd give me these work release prisoners, people that were in there because they had a drunk event or something. They were minor offenders, and load them into my car and go down to the baseball field, and they'd work with me during the day, and then I'd take them back that evening.
Any interesting stories about things that happened during that time?
While I was working with those prisoners, I don't know, they were really hard workers, actually. I was surprised. Yes, they would sweat out there, and it hot and humid, and they would work their tails off. I think the reason they did, though, is because they knew that if they didn't, they'd have to sit in jail. And working for this time during the day, they'd get 2 days for each day. So it helped them get out of jail quicker. I didn't have any incidents with any of them. None of them tried to run away, and none of them tried to do anything that was out of the ordinary. But it was an interesting experience, one I wasn't sure about when I started, but I really ended up enjoying those guys.
Tell me about college. What did you do in college, study, and then what did you do when you got out?
When I graduated from high school, no one ever said, "You're going to go to college," but I knew that they expected me to go to college. And like I said, I was the first one in our family to go to college. I had cousins that had already gone, but my mom and dad weren't able to go to college when they were growing up. And so that was just the expectation. I had a basketball scholarship to play at a smaller university in Arkansas, but I decided to stay home and go to the University of Arkansas there in Fayetteville. And I was glad I did. I thought that was a good experience for me, but I could live at home and drive. I actually rode into the university with my dad each day as he went to work. He had dropped me off, then he'd pick me up in the evening when he went home from work. I started college thinking I wanted to be a civil engineer, because that's basically what my dad was, and I respected him, and I thought that would be a good career for me. And I made it through my first year fine, and then got into my second year, and I just realized I didn't want to spend my life doing that. The drafting that you do and I don't know, it became less appealing, because it wasn't like I saw my dad working. It would have been more developing the plans rather than implementing the plans, it seemed. So halfway through my sophomore year, I switched to education as my major. And I majored in health and physical education and recreation, and had a minor in math and another minor in science, because I had started taking in my engineering classes. I took a lot of math, and I figured I might as well round that out so I'd have the ability to teach math. When I graduated from college, then I never taught health or physical education. The only teaching of that I did was when I had my practice teaching experience. But I did teach math, I did teach science, so I was glad I had those minors so I could qualify to do that.
Where did you teach, and what was it like?
When I left the university, my first teaching job, actually I was offered a position in Florida, in Key West, Florida, and then I had told them that I was interested in the job, and this was like in the spring semester of my senior year, like in January, February. And then in March, when we had our spring break, of that year, I went to Roswell, New Mexico to visit my cousin, Wanda Davis. And while I was there, I really enjoyed that. And of course, she was one of my favorite cousins. And so while I was there, she encouraged me to go to see if they had any positions, well, she knew they had positions, but to see if I could get a job there for the next year. So I went into the office and talked to them, and they hired me to teach at a middle school there. And so I sent a letter to Key West telling them I had changed my mind. I was going to go to New Mexico instead. And so I ended up there for my first job.
What was it like, and how long did you stay?
When I went to New Mexico, I loved it mainly because Wanda was there, and so I had a connection. I stayed there 6 years, and I really enjoyed all the time. I started teaching science there, and then they moved me to the high school after 4 years, and I taught at the high school, but I taught math then. So I really enjoyed that time. I enjoyed New Mexico. I did get tired of the wind and the sand in my face when I'd walk outside a lot of times. But I coached basketball, I coached track, I coached football, and even at high school I coached tennis some. So I had a lot of good experiences there. But anyway, that was my first 6 years, was in New Mexico and Roswell.
And what did you do next? Tell me about that.
Well, at the end of my 5th year in New Mexico, my parents came out and we went back to Oregon on vacation because we had relatives in Oregon. And so we were in Oregon for probably 2 weeks, something like that. And I remembered just how much I enjoyed Oregon and its climate and the people that I knew there. And while I was there, one of our relatives was a teacher in Portland, Oregon, and they were really short of teachers at that time, and she encouraged me to come out there if I wanted to, and really that had been a goal that I'd had since we lived in Oregon that year and my dad worked, and when we moved back I said someday I was going to come back. So I saw this as my opportunity, and also I met the woman that I married while I was out there. She lived in Oregon and she was going to school at the time. She was in college. And so I decided I was going to do the contract that I had in Roswell and then move to Oregon the next year. And so I told the people in Roswell that was happening, and then my wife Susan and I got married the next summer after my 6th year in Roswell, and I finally ended up with a job in Portland. But the next year when I went out there, it was 1970, and when I got there, that was the first time that they had budget restrictions placed in that state. All of a sudden people were not hiring, and I all of a sudden, instead of having a job just laid out for me, I had to really dig and search for one. And I didn't get a job in Portland until August, about a week before school started. And I had applied a whole bunch of places in the suburbs there. One of them, the guy told me he would love to hire me, but I had 6 years experience and he'd have to pay me too much. Portland told me I had 6 years experience and they wanted to hire me because I had 6 years experience, which impressed me. And so I spent my next 30 years in Portland. I didn't leave the district, although I had some opportunities to, but I felt like they gave me that opportunity when nobody else would, and so I tried to be loyal to them.
Tell me about your family that you raised, your kids.
Okay, my family, I raised with Susan. She was my first wife. We divorced after about 18 years. But during that time we had Tamara LeRae Tucker, and we had Robert Tucker, and we had Ryan Tucker. And Tammy was born in 1972, Rob was born in 1975, and Ryan was born in 1980. And Tammy and Ryan both lived in that area. It was in Hillsboro, just west of Portland itself. And that's where we lived when we were first married. Ryan actually still lives in Hillsboro. Tammy lives in North Plains, which is just north of there. And Rob lives in Oklahoma City now, and he works at Tinker Air Force Base. And so that attracted him to come to Oklahoma City. So they're all three being successful. I have two granddaughters through Tammy, and a granddaughter and a grandson for Ryan. And then Rob has two sons, plus in his second wife he has a son and a daughter. So those are my grandchildren.
Good. Tell me about where you went to school and what was it like in high school? I mean, as a kid, when you were a kid going to school, where did you go and what was it like?
When I was growing up, we lived on the farm, of course, and rode the bus to school each day. It was only about a 5-mile ride or something like that to Farmington, Arkansas. Real small town at that time. It's grown significantly now, but it's west of Fayetteville. And most of the people that went to school there, most of them lived on farms. Real small school. When I was going to Farmington, we had one building that had the elementary students up to high school through the 8th grade, and another building that had the 9th through 12th. And it was, like I say, it was small. My graduating class in 1960 was 25 people. So that tells you something about the size of the school. While I was going to school, I don't know, I had a lot of great experiences, had a lot of great friends. I ran with people both in Farmington and in Fayetteville, mostly with people in Fayetteville because of my cousin James Morris, and he and I were close buddies as well as cousins. But I played all kinds of sports. I played basketball, baseball, ran track when they needed somebody to run a long distance during a track meet. I never trained for track, but I just ran when they needed me to. And my senior year, I played football. That was the first year we had football, and it was a 6-man football team. So I had just 1 year experience with football, but I loved athletics, and I had good experience in high school. It was really good. I was the salutatorian for our class. Of course, again, out of 25, that's not as big a ribbon as you might get if you're in a bigger school. But it was the kind of school that was so small, you knew everybody and everybody knew you. And I remember that when we rode the bus, like I said, every day to school. If the bus driver was sick, there were 2 of us that were when we were in high school, that we would drive the bus instead. And that time they didn't, it was all in the country. They didn't worry about you having to have training with the bus and all that, licensing and everything. And young men would drive, and if he didn't drive, I drove. And we'd run the route and get all the kids to school and then take them home after school. So that was a neat experience.
Who were some of the teachers that you remember?
The teachers I remember, my first teacher, Mrs. Brown, Marie Brown, was my first grade teacher. We didn't have kindergarten when I was going to school, but I remember her. Thing I remember most about her, I liked her. She was a really nice lady, but if you did something wrong, she rapped your knuckles with a ruler. And she'd make you hold your hands out. She never had to hit my hands because I didn't want my knuckles hit. But I remember a lot of kids getting their knuckles hit by that ruler. My second teacher was Mrs. Beckett, and I really liked her. I mean, I liked all my teachers. They were all very different, but we had just one class for each grade. There wasn't any. Everybody had the same teachers and series as we went through. So they knew us because they knew our parents. And, I always knew that if I got in trouble at school, I was going to really get in trouble when I got home. So I tried to behave. And the first time we had different teachers was when we got to high school. Otherwise it was all one self-contained classroom. So I had good experiences. I knew everybody from first all the way through. I think we may have started with maybe 25 to 30 and ended up with that 25 in our graduating class. So people stayed. People didn't even move in and out. It was basically the same people. We may have added 2 or 3 people during the whole time I was going to school there for 12 years.
Where did you go to church, and who are some of the people you remember from church?
We went to church real near our house. I mentioned earlier that the Highland Church was between where we lived and where Grandmother Tucker lived when I was growing up. But it was a small community church, had been there, I honestly don't know when it was built, but had been there all of my life and more. We had a full-time preacher for a while, and then the congregation got smaller because people just weren't as many people living there, or if they did, they went to different churches. And so we started having preachers who, like one that taught at John Brown University, and he would come over and preach for us. I remember having revivals there. We'd have a revival every summer, and the preachers would come from, they were traveling preachers, so that was always a really interesting week. And they had tabernacle down at Savoy, and we'd go down to that. So we did a lot of tabernacling and going to church during the summer especially. But we went every Sunday. My mom and dad were active in the church. My dad taught Sunday school for the adults. My mom and dad together were the treasurer for years, I think until just before my dad passed away. And also a memory at the church, although I didn't go to school there, it was a schoolhouse at one time, and my mom and dad met in that schoolhouse. Him from one side of the hill and her from the other, and they went to school there until they got through, I think they went there for 5 years, and then they started going over to Farmington when they got older. And so they were in school all the way through together. And my grandmother Tucker taught Sunday school when I was growing up, so she was always my teacher, so knew her in a different way there. She also taught at the school when it was a public school there. So.
What did she teach and what?
Well, she taught everything because it was a one-room schoolhouse, therefore, and one-room church, and she had all the kids that wanted to go to school there, and she taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and she taught about life because of who she was. So all the kids just went there, and she taught if whatever grade they were, she provided the lessons they needed. Quite a lady.
Let's see. Tell me, did your father ever tell you how his family ended up in Arkansas, and if so, what was the story?
Well, my dad spent a lot of time telling me about my family because largely I think he wanted me to know because I never knew my grandfather, and he wanted me to be sure that I had some information about him. He died from a tick bite, is what he died from before I was born, as I said earlier. And my dad, I remember him talking about he had two sisters, Beulah and Dixie, and he had an older brother, Frank. And they were all, with the exception of Dixie, they were all born in Indiana. And they went from Indiana to Oklahoma in a covered wagon, stayed there for a few years, and Aunt Dixie was born there. And then they moved from there to Arkansas in a covered wagon again. Some of the kids were sick when they moved there. As far as I know, Aunt Dixie and my dad were the sickest. And I don't know if the other two had this malaria or whatever it was at that time or not. But again, they came in a covered wagon. They really thought they were going to go farther up into Missouri, but they found this area around Highland community as they were going through, and I don't know why they stopped, but they liked it and they just stayed there and were able to buy some land. My grandfather was a carpenter, as I said earlier, and so he was able to get work in town, had to ride a horse into town or drive the wagon, whichever it was. But I know my dad talks about walking into town, and that was about 7-8 miles from where they lived, so it's a pretty good walk, but that was the way they got around.
What are some other stories you remember your dad or mom telling you when you were a kid?
Oh, Lord. My parents, we didn't have TV, we had a radio and sitting around, so they did a lot of talking about how life was when they were growing up. And one thing I remember is Aunt Beulah's husband, my Uncle Ray Davis, and my dad were buddies when they were growing up. And they lived pretty close to each other, and that was one person that Dad walked into town with a lot. And he talks about one time when they were coming back, I don't know what they had been doing, but as they were coming back, Uncle Ray needed to go to the bathroom. And of course they were out in the country, so it was okay. He just went over to the side of the road and started going to the bathroom. And my dad, it wasn't my dad, it was his older brother, Uncle Frank, had known that they were coming, and he was walking up to meet them, and he saw them coming, and so he kind of hid. And while Uncle Ray was going to the bathroom, he jumped out from behind this tree, and Uncle Ray just about fainted. He had just started going to the bathroom, and he stopped and he couldn't start again. He said he was so scared. It just stopped the waterworks. But I remember that. They did a lot of getting together with the neighbors in that area. We even did that when I was young. We'd go down to a neighbor's, and some of the guys would play guitars, and some would well, mostly guitars. One guy had a steel guitar, the others just had regular guitars, and they'd play and sing, and we'd all sing with them, mainly listen to them. But we did that a lot on Saturday nights in the summer. Mom and Dad did that kind of thing. They worked a lot because they lived on a farm, and so they were the farm hands. I don't know, my mom mainly talks about time she spent with her mom, watching her work and planting gardens and harvesting them and that kind of thing. I don't remember her talking so much about who they played with and that kind of stuff. She had two sisters and a brother, and they mainly just took, they made their own clothes, and they canned and cooked and that kind of thing. So I don't know how much playing that they did, but anyway, it was a pretty simple life that they had, but not a real easy life.
When you were a kid, you talked some about this, but go into more detail. When you were a kid, you and your brother and your uncle or your cousin and your friends or whoever would have been your playmates. What would y'all do for fun?
When I was growing up, of course, being on the farm, I had the run of the farm. Mom would let us go out, and we could spend the whole day out running in the field, playing baseball. Uh, we had from the house, if we went east, there was a big hollow down there that was part of their land, and it was forested. And we'd go down there. My cousin James Morris would come out. He loved to come out and visit us. He'd spend the night, and we'd go up in that hollow. We built a big teepee up there. Put sticks together and then covered them with burlap. So we had us a teepee up there that we played in, and we'd be up there with just mainly he and Gerald, my brother, and I. And we'd find reasons to send Gerald back to the house to get water or something, so we'd just have some time, just the two of us, like I said. We had horses when we were growing up, two of them. They were work horses, but we could ride them. And when James and Owanda and Boyce were all there, we'd all of us get on the horse at the same time, so there'd be four of us on the horse. Gerald was too young at that time to ride with us, but we'd do bareback riding. And I remember this one horse named Kate. When we'd get on her, sometimes we'd go down into the woods, and if she got tired of us riding her, she would find a low-hanging branch and just scrape us off. She'd walk under it, and we'd just go boom, boom, boom off the back. If we were at the house, she'd go under the clothesline. And she'd let us ride her for quite a while, and then she'd get rid of us, and we were through with our horse riding for that day. I know James and I, our favorite game, I guess, if we had a favorite game when we got to be a little older, was wiffle ball. And we had a place out west of our house, out toward the barn, that we made us a baseball field and played wiffle ball by the hour. And we were St. Louis Cardinal fans, and so we'd pretend we were the St. Louis Cardinal players at different times, and we spent, I can't tell you how many hours we spent playing wiffle ball out there. Rode our bicycles when we got older and had them. We didn't have bicycles until we were I was in the 8th grade when we came back from Oregon. We had gotten bicycles over when we were out in Oregon. We brought them back with us. But we rode bicycles on the dirt road. It's now paved, but it was dirt then. I do remember when we were real young, we had a cellar out back that Mom put all of her canned goods in. And it was a concrete cellar, and it was like a dome. And we'd get up on the top of that with our tricycles and skate off of it on the tricycle. And of course, we dumped ourselves more than we made it down successfully. But we did a lot of that. We're always outside doing something, it seemed like. Inside activities mainly was listening to the St. Louis Cardinals baseball games. I remember sitting with my dad and brother and mother and listening to those games until we finally got a TV in the mid-50s.
What would you mentioned some music and singing and stuff, but what would your parents and their friends do for fun when you were a kid?
When I was growing up, the families just generally got together a lot because they didn't have, like I said, didn't have TVs, didn't have all the gadgets that we now have. And so people would come over and we'd make homemade ice cream out in the back with a freezer, and that was always fun, so I really enjoyed that. They would play cards. We'd play all kinds of board games. As soon as you were old enough, then you learned how to roll the dice and count the numbers and move the people. So we did a lot of board games. Dominoes, I remember playing dominoes a lot. Uncle Bill Morris, James's dad, was a really big domino player, and so he liked for us to play dominoes when he was out. It was mainly just sitting around the table playing some kind of game, or having coffee and dessert sitting in the kitchen, but just visiting with the neighbors when they came up, or we'd go to their house and do the same things. What I remember, I guess, is my childhood was pretty carefree. We didn't have any money. When my dad was farming, we bought basic goods, flour and sugar and that kind of stuff. But everything else, the milk came from the cows, the vegetables came from the garden, and the meat came from the cattle or the pigs. It was really a basic kind of life, and it was one that I felt I really enjoyed, and I was fortunate to experience that. At the same time, I always wondered what it would be like to have money and be able to do some of the things that some of my friends were able to do. I remember the first trip that we took in our car. We had a pickup until 1952. Dad bought a Plymouth car, and our first trip was to go to Indiana, where he was born, and his only male cousin lived in Indiana still, and so we went up there, and I remember our first day out, we stopped at some restaurant for lunch, and I can count on one hand with several fingers left over how many times we had ever eaten other than at home or somebody else's home. People just didn't go out to eat then. So we stopped at this restaurant to have lunch, and the waitress all brought us menus and brought our water and set it down. And while we were waiting for our food, I remember drinking some water, and then she came and filled it up. And I drank some more water, and she came and filled it up again. And I finally said to Mom, I can't drink any more water. She said, well, you don't have to drink it. She's filling it up because you're drinking it all the time. And I'll never forget that experience, because I thought you had to drink it if somebody gave it to you, because that's my first time in a sit-down restaurant. So anyway, that was just made an impression on me. I've never forgotten. I was kind of embarrassed about it at the time, but anyway, it's one of those things that you never forget. I remember feeling like because of the way we grew up and the poverty level, I guess it was, even though I didn't feel poor, I just felt like being there, the term hillbilly applied to us, and that bothered me. I remember that. Wishing that didn't have that stigma, and it was more my stigma than anybody else ever saying anything about it. But that was something I've always carried with me, and I'm sure it has affected some of the decisions I made since then.
If somebody asks you, someone who didn't know anything at all about your dad, never met him, didn't know anything about him, and said, how would you describe Bob Tucker? What would you tell him?
My father, Bob Tucker, was a real gentleman. He was gentle. He cared for other people. If anybody in our whole community had a problem or needed to work through, find a solution to a problem, he was the person they'd come to, seemed like. I can remember him raising his voice very few times, but if he did, you better be listening to him. And he rarely got angry with Gerald and me, but when he looked at us and said, you need to stop, we stopped. And he had a presence, I think. And I'll never forget, one night we were there at the house and somebody knocked on the door. It was a woman that lived up close to the church. And she came in, and she came down to see my dad because her husband had been beating her. And she needed help. He brought her in, and he called the police to come out. and they came out and took care of her and dealt with the situation. But the reason I say she came down to us, she walked by 4 or 5 other houses to get to see my dad. I know she came down to see my dad and walked past those other houses because she knew that he would really do something. He would take care of her. I'm sorry. I just always remember how kind he was. And everybody knew that. And I had never known anybody who was in that kind of abusive situation. I didn't know she was until then. And I think my dad was aware of it. But anyway, that just tells you who he was.
What about your mom? If someone said, "Tell me about your mom," what would you tell them?
Oh, the salt of the earth. She grew up in a hard situation because of lack of money. Our brother went to college, but none of the girls were able to go because they couldn't afford it or whatever. But she was a great cook, great mother, and she would let us know where our lines were. She did it very gently. I remember she made quilts. I still have some of the quilts that she made. And I remember her and my grandmother and my aunt, Thelma, who lived just down the road from us also, sitting in our living room with the quilt frame hanging from the ceiling, and they'd sit there by the hour during the day doing their hand stitching on the quilts. She grew, when I was growing up, like I said, we didn't have power in the house or water in the house. So we lived with lanterns. We had a wood stove. She had to heat all of her water that she used and cook on that wood stove. And so her life wasn't easy, but she was really good at everything she did. And she was just a good person. I remember every Monday she would go and we would go down. She'd take us when we were real young. We'd go down to Grandma's house, and I told her we could see it down the way, and we'd take our dirty clothes down there, and they'd start a fire under the water kettle, and they washed the clothes. They had a wringer that was hand cranked to put the clothes through, hung them on the line, and that was the Monday experience every week. As long as my grandma lived down there. Well, not until then, but until we got electricity. And then we got a washer and dryer. Man, we were living uptown then. So, but she made her own clothes when I was growing up. Her dresses were made out of feed sacks. She made shirts for us. The only thing we bought were jeans and shoes and socks. She made everything else.
What year did you get electricity?
We got electricity about 1952, around in there. I was about, no, it must have been 1950, because I was about 8 years old when we got it. So rural electric power came out that far. And because we had electricity then, we were able to pump the water up instead of hand pulling it out of the well. And then Dad got it piped into the house, so we really were uptown then.
If somebody, or finish this sentence for me. My favorite thing about my mom was?
My favorite thing about my mom was the way that she cared for all of us, doing all the things to make our life okay, and she cooked like a dream, always had plenty of food on the table, and she was always there when we needed her.
What about your dad? Your favorite thing about my favorite thing about my dad?
My favorite thing about my dad was the lessons that he taught me, and the way he modeled the way a person should be